So I've had the a67 for the last 6 months, and I have to say that overall, this is an awesome, amazing camera. If you've watched any of my other videos on this camera, I will tell you how much I love this camera. I mean, it's about the grip, it's the ability to be able to change the shutter speed and the aperture by having these two click rings. It's just a really good, well-rounded camera for the most part. And I just love the size and weight of this tiny, small little camera. And mostly it's just the ergonomic grip compared to any other Sony cameras, or if you look at any of the other Sony APS-C cameras, they have those really small grips on it. And I love that this camera has a good grip. And I was shooting with the Sony a7C for a long time, and it just got really annoying not having that grip, but this fixes all the problem. Right now I have on it the Sony 24-105, which this is kind of a large lens, but I kind of feel like it fits like the camera body perfectly. And I don't recommend this lens for this camera body, but I use it with my full frame camera, so I ended up just kind of keeping it anyway. So why do I use the Sony a6700? I just think it's a really good versatile camera for anyone who is from beginner to pretty much advanced. I was using pro cameras for a long period of time. I've shot before with the A7R, the A7R III, the A7 III, the A7 IV, which I kind of think, I know those aren't like the most professional cameras, but if you're like a landscape photographer, if you're just doing portrait work or wildlife, I think those are excellent cameras. And then I switched to this camera, and it's a lot cheaper than most of those cameras starting out because it's an APS-C sensor. And I've just kind of come to this realization that APS-C really isn't that bad. There are a few situations where I've had issues with this camera, and it's mainly if I'm shooting with like a telephoto lens with my Tamron 50-400. I'm shooting at f6.3, and the sun is starting to go down. So if it's starting to get darker, I have to really bump up the ISO, and so those pictures come out a little bit noisier, but that's usually something that I can just fix in Lightroom later, and so it's really not that big of a deal. I prefer shooting with full frame cameras. If I had a full frame sensor that could do what this camera could do, I wouldn't mind having that. But the problem is, every single full frame camera out there has massive, huge lenses that are really heavy, and that's why I gravitate to the a6700. And I think that's just an incredible reason why you might consider using this camera. If you are traveling, if you are going on location for shoots, if you're doing wildlife photography, if you're backpacking, if you're doing hiking, if you are shooting a sporting event and you don't want to carry a ton of gear, the a6700 is just so much lighter, and then it also has that crop range. So if you don't have to have an extra telephoto lens to kind of get that extra reach, it's kind of built in already. It already has a 2x converter or a 1.5x converter, and you can crop in a little bit more because it's giving you 26 megapixels. So that's why I use it. I think it's an excellent lens. Like the Sony a7R V, it does an amazing job for portraits, for wildlife, for sports, for landscapes. Now, I haven't used it much for astrophotography. I have been using my Sony ZV-E1 for that, but I think that it could probably do a decent job. I actually was a little bit disappointed with my low light camera, which is pretty much the best low light camera that you can get, the ZV-E1 or the A7S III for shooting low light, and I just was a little bit disappointed on how it did for noise when shooting the night sky at perfect dark sky conditions, no light pollution whatsoever. It just didn't do that great of a job as what I thought it could do. Okay, another thing that's really cool about this camera is it pairs well with the Sony ZV-E1. I use both these cameras interchangeably. I think that if you actually shoot both, like if you do video and you compare these cameras side by side, they're actually pretty similar. The a6700 is not going to do as well in low light, but for everything else, it does a really good job. And if you are shooting with this and the ZV-1, you're not going to be disappointed with video performance. Next up is design. So for ergonomics, I've kind of talked about this earlier. The ergonomics on this camera is just really good. If you have really large hands, this camera is probably not the camera to get. You probably would have to add a little extension at the bottom. I know a lot of people are doing this. And it's just a little adaptive grip on the bottom to kind of have some extra space for your pinky. I would say overall, the camera grip on this camera is pretty similar to any of the pro cameras like the A7 IV, the a7R5, the new Sony A9. Pretty similar, not as good because those are just a little bit taller of a camera, and so you're gonna have a little bit better grip for the pinky. But for the most part, I mean, for me, I'm able to fit my pinky on there. I don't have any issues with it. I think it's a great grip. And going from the A7C to this camera was a huge upgrade for me, and that's one reason why I love this camera. Now, comparing it again to the A7C, like it wasn't hard for me to change between that camera and this camera at all. I would say they're pretty much the same size. So if you were looking at the A7C or A7C2 or A7CR, they're gonna be pretty much similar to this camera, but this camera is gonna have, I actually bought the ZV-1 thinking it was gonna be, it is the lightest small camera setup and it's full frame, and so I bought it for that reason. But carrying that camera and this camera, like I don't notice any difference at all. I just noticed that this camera has a much better grip on it. Another thing about design, so the camera door. A lot of people don't like the camera door, or they prefer the camera door with some of the other pro cameras. I don't have any issues with the camera door. I actually prefer the camera door on these smaller camera bodies compared to when I was using the A7 IV. When I dropped the A7 IV, the camera door kind of broke a little bit, and it's because like there's a spring in it and you have to push it in and out with your thumb. I didn't like the design of the camera door. I actually prefer this one because you just click it and it opens. And then because I dropped it, I couldn't close the door, and it was hard. I didn't want to like break the door off or anything like that. The camera door on this I think is much better. It's much more solid. There's no spring in it. It just easily closes. Well, there probably is a spring to kind of keep it open. And then speaking of like SD card slots and things like that, so a lot of people don't want this camera because it only has one memory card slot. For me, that's not an issue. I've been using digital cameras since they came out back in the early 2000s. With the Nikon D100, I've never had a memory card fail on me. I'm buying like these cheap junk quality memory cards. I have a ton of like the cheap SanDisk ones. Right now I'm shooting on Lexar, and I think that I haven't had any issues with them like whatsoever. They do great for video, for photo. Haven't had an issue with them, and so that's why I've never found a reason to have two SD card slots. So single card slot for me, not really an issue. Okay, what about performance? So this camera pretty much acts as a mini A7R5. You pretty much get all the same internal features and a little bit more when it comes to some of the AI functionality. Now, you don't get the EVF, that's one of the cons. I wish this camera had a better EVF like the A7R5. I think the new EVFs are incredible. I don't love the EVF on this one, but it is much better than the A7C and the A6000 series cameras, or A6100. They have improved the EVF, but a lot of stuff that I've been doing on this camera anyways, I've been just using the back screen and the monitor, and so I haven't even really needed to use it unless there's these really bright conditions. And in those situations, I've loved to just have an EVF, or my ZV-1, I don't have one at all. So that's one main reason why I think this is a better camera than the ZV-E1. But for everything else, yeah, I think it does a fantastic job at just being a really good APS-C camera and also doing well in low light conditions. And the performance on this camera is pretty much the same as the A7R5. So if you are looking for a budget camera, or if you want to just buy multiple cameras, I think this is a great one to get. Video performance, it's got everything that the A7R5 has, pretty much. I think it's pretty much in line with the ZV-E1. I've actually thought about selling my ZV-E1 recently because the video performance is just so good on this camera, and the low light capabilities, I don't really see a huge need to kind of keep the ZV-1, but for now I'm going to keep it because I actually kind of like some of the AI features of the ZV-1, especially if you're doing like, you're showing something and it's, what is it called? Product showcase, where it will focus on this rather than your eyes. There's just a few features. Okay, megapixels. So this camera has 26 megapixels, and I haven't found that I've really ever needed more than 26 megapixels unless I'm really cropping in. I love the A7 IV that it had like 36 megapixels. I kind of felt like that's the sweet spot. I think it's 33. Yeah, the A7 IV has 33 megapixels. With the 60 megapixels on the A7R5, I almost think that's too much. It takes up too much space on my computer and my hard drives. So I actually prefer anything under 33. That's kind of where I lean to, and everything I want more than 20. So anything below 33 and 20, I think is a good place. But for the most part, megapixels aren't really an issue, and I think that 26 is plenty for my needs. If I need more, you can do like panos or do multiple images. And some people just say that this camera might not shoot as sharp of images because it doesn't have the resolution, or maybe it doesn't have as sharp of lenses. And I've like comparing this camera with and lenses with any other camera that I've owned, like full frame camera and lenses, I haven't noticed a difference at all. I think it does a really good job. If you're a pixel peeper and you're really obsessed with high resolution, I would say just go get the A7R5. But for me, it's been completely fine for my needs. I went from like really wanting pixel peeping and really wanting those high resolution cameras to now I'm at a place where I don't really, I mean, as long as it has 20 megapixels and it has a decent lens on it, I'm completely content with it. Okay, so why should you choose the a6700 over any other camera? If you were just looking for a really good budget camera, I think this is the one to get. I know it's not the cheapest, but I think if you're looking at something around the 1200 price range, I think it's the best camera that you can get for its price. A lot of people like look towards Canon, and the problem with Canon APS-C, they have really good cameras, but they don't have the lens selection. They don't have hardly any APS-C lenses, and that's why I decided on Sony. And I actually would consider getting a Canon camera if they had more options for the APS-C lenses. They have, like Canon does a really good job at making lightweight lenses, and they have a lot of really good full frame lightweight lenses, but they don't have anything for APS-C. And so that's why I went with Sony, because I think that Canon is actually a lot more affordable, except for the exception of their lenses, but their camera bodies are way cheaper. And I think that if you are looking to get a camera in this price range, I think Sony is really the one to get, because you're not going to get the same lens selection with other camera manufacturers like Nikon or Canon. They just don't have the APS lens options out there, and for me, I'm more interested in having a lightweight camera, and Sony just has like a vast amount of lightweight APS-C lenses. So the reason I got this camera over others is just because of its size, it's lightweight, there's a huge lens selection, and then the performance that you get with this camera is pretty much on par with any other camera that you can get out there, because it has the same autofocus performance as like the A7R5, and even with like Canon with like, I would say the R6, the R7, you're not gonna find a camera that's much better than this unless you're looking at the really high-end pro model cameras. Okay, so the one other con that I wanna mention with this camera, first of all, it's the EVF. It doesn't have a great EVF. Second of all, they didn't put a nice place for the hot shoe. So it's right here next to the EVF, and if I slide the Rode Wireless Go mics, they're a little bit too large to fit on the hot shoe, and they do make some like third-party adapters that you can kind of move the hot shoe over, but it just adds extra weight. It's just something that I'm not really interested in. So that's my long-term review of the a6700. I think it's a really good camera in general. If you have any questions or if there's anything I haven't mentioned, please leave it in the comments below, and please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.